And now to our story. Abba Eban, Israel's ambassador to the United States, is a scholar, a linguist, a persuasive orator, a veteran statesman at the age of 43. He has been called the voice of Israel, which is also the title of his book. Tonight, in order to clarify Israel's problems, her hopes, and her aspirations, we shall put to Ambassador Eban questions raised by Israel's critics, some of them by her enemies. Mr. Ambassador, in its 10 years as a nation, Israel has been involved in repeated violence, major border incidents, 2 open wars with the Arabs, the first in 48, the last in 56. What do you foresee for the next 10 years? Do you foresee continuing violence?
Well, Mr. Wallace, the last 10 years have not only been years of violence, they have been incomparable years of joyous creation, of sovereignty restored, of a people gathered in, of a land revived, of democracy established, but there has also been violence imposed by the hostility of our neighbors. For our second decade, we devoutly hope for a period of peaceful consolidation. We hope that there will be no recurrence of the violent conflicts which marked our first decade, but that we and our kindred neighboring people will devote all our efforts to the development of our respective countries and of our common region.
You say that you hope for peace. Back in September of 56, you called Egypt's President Nasser Israel's most perilous adversary. Now today, Colonel Nasser would seem to be even stronger. He's the head of the merged Egyptian and Syrian nations. He's apparently regaining the friendship of Saudi Arabia. The populations, if not the leadership, of Jordan and Iraq look to him for inspiration. How does this all affect Israel?
Well, at present, Nasser's policy is one of acquiescence towards us, and there has been a relative tranquility on our frontier with him. Perhaps the memories of the Sinai expedition have had a salutary effect in causing him to avoid his previous belligerent provocations, but basically we have not changed our views on Nasser and Nasserism. He claims freedom for Egypt, he denies freedom for his neighbor Israel. In his relations with Middle Eastern states, his policy is one of hegemony. He is not content to look after Egypt's troubled and complex affairs. He seeks to impose his domination over other states in the area. All over the Middle East, you'll find governments just as worried by his pretensions to hegemony as ourselves, and he's brought the great power conflict into the Middle East in order to maneuver between the power blocks.
All over the Middle East, too, though, will you not find that the huge majority of the Arab peoples are interested in the extermination of Israel?
We find that the governments of Arab countries still articulate the aim of our extermination. But I think it's beyond their powers to achieve it, and of course, in any international system which respects law and morality, there must be resistance to any such policy.
Do you think that we are currently going through a lull before the storm? Our former Secretary of the Air Force, Thomas Finletter, told Zionist leaders in America just a month ago that the present Middle East situation is a lull before a possible storm, and he added that we have good reason, he said, to be apprehensive over the ultimate direction of the Arab mergers.
I think a great degree of vigilance is called for so long as Arab policy continues to be devoted, if only verbally, to the vision of Israel's destruction. On the other hand, if this lull, as you call it, if this tranquility can be preserved, if passions are calmed, if Israel gives an ever-increasing demonstration of her permanence and stability, I don't exclude the possibility that the present lull might merge into a climate more conducive to peace.
Well, a lull will emerge into a climate more conducive to peace if perhaps some of the issues behind the Arab-Israeli hostility can be settled. Let's take a look at them. First, the refugee problem. An estimated 700,000 Palestinian Arabs were left homeless during the Arab-Israeli War of 48. Israel refuses to readmit them. They live in bitterness, and such men as historian Arnold Toynbee has said this: the evil deeds committed by the Zionist Jews against the Arabs are comparable to crimes committed against the Jews by the Nazis. How do you feel about that?
Well, about Professor Toynbee's statement, I can only repeat what I've written, that it is a monstrous blasphemy. Here he takes the massacre of millions of our men, women, and children, and he compares it to the plight of Arab refugees alive on their kindred soil, suffering certain anguish, but of course possessed of the supreme gift of life. This equation between massacre and temporary suffering, which can easily be alleviated, is, I think, a distortion of any historic perspective. But the refugee problem, Mr. Wallace, isn't the cause of tension. The refugee problem is the result of an Arab policy which created the problem by the invasion of Israel, which perpetuates it by refusing to accommodate them into their expanding labor market, and which refuses to solve a problem which they have the full capacity to solve. There is, I think, a basic immorality in this attitude of Arab governments to their own kinsmen, whose plight they could relieve immediately once the will to relieve it existed. All world opinion admits that the problem can only be solved on a regional basis by opening the vast resources of the Arab world to this Arab refugee population, and if there were such an effort on their part to approach a regional settlement, Israel would make its due and just contribution.
Of course, the problem of the refugees is allied with the problem of territorial expansion on the part of Israel. A major Arab spokesman here in the United States, Dr. Fayez Saeg, says this. He says the area of the territories held by Israel today exceeds by about 40% the area of the territories given Israel by the United Nations. Most of this added area, he says, was taken by force and should therefore be relinquished by Israel.
Well, I think this gentleman need not lose any sleep at night worrying about whether the state of Israel is too big. Really, there is nothing more grotesque or eccentric in the international life of our times than the doctrine that little Israel, 8,000 square miles in area, should become even smaller in order that the vast Arab empire should still further expand. There are really two aspects, Mr. Wallace, to every territorial problem, the legal aspect and the moral aspect. The law is clear. The present territorial frontiers rest on agreements between Israel and the Arab states, which cannot be changed except by consent. The Arab states have signed those agreements, which give them and us a veto power against any territorial change to which we do not agree, so that there's no legal abuse in the present situation.
Well, you and the Arabs have hardly signed a territorial agreement that involves what territory Israel took as a result of the 48 war.
Oh, yes, we have. The present agreements between Israel and the Arab states delimit the precise territory which we hold now. Israel does not possess a single inch of territory beyond the valid agreements which she has signed and which the United Nations has ratified. And
under the terms of an armistice,
yes,
pending final settlement.
Yes, but in that final settlement, as it is written in the agreements, no changes can be accepted without the consent of both parties. So we are within our rights, and they are within their rights in accepting or refusing any change. So there's nothing whatever illegal about any aspect of the present territorial question, but the moral issue is the most important here.
Well, now that's the point that I would like to talk to, if I may. The fact remains, when we talk about morality, the fact remains that Israel benefited territorially from a war, from armed violence.
Yes, I'm glad to say that I hope that whenever countries wage a war of aggression, as the Arab states did, that they should be the losers by waging that war of aggression.
Well, as a member of the Judaic faith, which cherishes social justice and morality, do you believe that any country should profit territorially from violence?
Mr. Wallace, I'm not going into the history of other countries, and I'm not going to analyze how the frontiers of countries which I've seen or in which I've served were achieved. But we have certainly achieved our territorial settlement as a result of agreements, not as a result of violence. It was they who decreed the method by which the present frontiers were achieved. They rejected the 1947 recommendation. We said, let us have boundaries by international agreement. They said, let us fix our boundaries by war. And they made the war